I always thought I was good at keeping my distance, especially from those who got too close. But this summer changed everything. He walked into my house, and with him came something I'd spent years trying to bury. One quiet night, I realized I couldn't hide it anymore. The late afternoon sun filtered gently through the sheer curtains, casting golden streaks across the wooden floorboards of the quiet home. Adrian Cole sat at his dining table, organizing a few old books that had gathered dust over the past year. He moved slowly, methodically, his motions more for comfort than productivity. The silence of the house was familiar, even soothing, broken only by the distant hum of cicadas and the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. It had been 2 weeks since Micah Sloan moved in. What began as a temporary arrangement had quickly folded into routine. Micah, with his unkempt curls and paint-stained fingers, brought a kind of unpredictable rhythm to Adrian's life, one that felt both unsettling and quietly magnetic. He wasn't a stranger, not exactly. Years ago, Micah had been the kid who tagged along to holiday dinners, the boy who barely spoke during family gatherings. Now he was a man, older, more confident, though his eyes still carried the weight of unspoken things. The house had changed since his arrival. It no longer echoed the way it used to. Micah's presence filled the quiet with something invisible but palpable. He wasn't loud, but he was there, in the music that drifted from the spare bedroom, in the wet footprints on the bathroom tile, in the coffee left half-finished in the kitchen. Adrian had always valued solitude, but lately he found himself listening for footsteps in the hallway or the soft thump of a door closing at night. On this particular evening, the heat had softened and a slow breeze wandered through the open windows. Adrian leaned back in his chair, allowing himself a moment to stare out across the lawn. He spotted Micah sitting on the back steps, sketchbook in his lap, barefoot and cross-legged, a pencil moving quickly across the page. There was a certain peace in watching him like that. Natural, quiet, undisturbed. Adrian stood, drawn by something he couldn't name. He walked through the living room, pausing briefly at the threshold of the back door before stepping outside. The wooden boards creaked beneath his feet, but Micah didn't look up. He remained focused, shading in some detail with the edge of his pencil. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and something sweeter, maybe Micah's cologne or just the warmth of the summer itself. Adrian didn't speak. Instead, he sat on the step beside him, not too close. They sat like that for several minutes, surrounded by the quiet rhythm of a suburban evening. Micah eventually closed his sketchbook and set it aside. Still, neither of them broke the silence. It wasn't awkward. It simply was. Adrian glanced over, and for the first time really saw him, not as a guest or a temporary presence, but as a man. There was something in Micah's profile, the softness around his jaw, the tension behind his eyes, that felt newly unfamiliar. Or perhaps it had always been there, unnoticed. He turned his gaze back toward the fading light, but the thought remained. Something had shifted. That night, the house was still again. Adrian stood in the kitchen, washing the last of the dishes. The sound of water running, the clink of ceramic, normal sounds in an otherwise quiet space. But his mind was elsewhere. Upstairs, he could hear movement, the subtle creak of a floorboard. Micah preparing for bed. Adrian dried his hands and leaned against the counter, suddenly aware of the hour, of the silence between rooms. Later, as Adrian lay in bed, the fan above turning slowly, shadows danced across the ceiling. He closed his eyes, trying to let sleep take him. But behind the silence was a buzz he couldn't ignore. A presence in the house. A closeness he hadn't expected to feel. Not longing, not yet. Just awareness. He listened to the stillness, to his own breath, to the thrum of something quiet and growing. And though nothing had happened, nothing had changed in any obvious way, Adrian knew, with a clarity that surprised him, that this summer would be unlike the others. The boundary between past and present was shifting, and whatever was coming had already begun. The clock on Adrian's nightstand blinked 12:47 a.m. in soft red digits. The room was dark except for the pale light from the street lamp filtering through the curtains, painting long shadows across the ceiling. He lay on his back, unmoving, eyes open, listening to the faint creaks of the house settling in the night air. Sleep refused to come. His thoughts, normally quiet companions at this hour, were relentless, each one orbiting around the same thing, or rather, the same person. Ever since Micah moved in, the silence of the house had changed shape. It was no longer peaceful. It was charged, like the quiet before a storm. He turned onto his side, facing the window. The air was still. The hum of the fan blended with the occasional rustle of leaves outside. A perfect summer night, yet the stillness pressed on him. He hadn't seen Micah since dinner. They'd spoken little, just small exchanges about groceries and the weather. Mundane, easy practiced, but under the surface something stirred. A current they both seemed aware of, but neither acknowledged. Adrian reached for his phone out of habit. No new messages. He set it back down, exhaled, and closed his eyes. But a moment later, there it was. The sound of light footsteps in the hallway. Soft, hesitant. The doorknob turned, slowly. Then came the quietest creak as the door edged open. Adrian didn't move. His heart picked up pace, his body instantly alert despite the hour. He knew it was Micah. There was no voice, no greeting, just the shape of him in the doorway, dimly outlined by the faint glow from the hallway light. Adrian could make out the silhouette, tall, lean, unmoving. Micah didn't ask permission. He didn't explain. He simply stepped inside and gently shut the door behind him. The room fell back into darkness, save for the faintest light through the window. Adrian sat up slightly, unsure of what to say, if anything at all. Micah crossed the room and stood at the edge of the bed. He wasn't dressed for sleep, just in a worn t-shirt and loose joggers, barefoot, silent. His expression was unreadable in the dim light, but his posture said more than words could. He wasn't here by accident. Still, Adrian said nothing. The silence between them was louder than any conversation. Micah sat down on the far side of the bed, facing away. For a moment, they just breathed. Two people separated by a lifetime of boundaries and one fragile thread of something unspoken. Adrian's mind raced with questions he couldn't voice. Why now? What did it mean? And most importantly, what would he do? He shifted, slowly, leaning back against the headboard. The space between them felt both impossibly close and insurmountably wide. Micah's voice broke the silence at last. Barely a whisper. I couldn't sleep. The sentence floated in the air, landing softly but leaving impact. Adrian didn't respond. He didn't need to. The statement wasn't about sleep. Micah lay back, turning slightly toward him. The mattress dipped with his movement, the weight of his presence settling like gravity. His gaze found Adrian's, even in the dark. There were no accusations, no explanations, just a moment. Adrian looked away, his eyes tracing the patterns of shadows on the ceiling. The air between them thickened, heavy with hesitation, with restraint, with the kind of tension that builds slowly, quietly, until it's too dense to hold. Memories flickered. A glance in the kitchen days ago, fingers brushing when they both reached for the same book. Laughter that lingered longer than it should have. All innocent, all forgettable, until now. Micah didn't move closer, but his presence filled the space between them. Adrian felt the pull, the warmth, the awareness that something had crossed a threshold. He told himself this was nothing, that they were just two tired people sharing silence. But the lie didn't settle. It tangled inside him, thrashing against the truth. His breath slowed, deepened. He could hear Micah's, quiet but uneven. They didn't touch. They didn't speak again, but the silence said enough. When Adrian finally closed his eyes, the world around him had shifted. Something real, fragile, and irreversible had begun to take shape. Not in action, but in possibility. By morning, nothing would be said. Breakfast would be quiet. Coffee would be poured like always. But the air would be different. The space between them, charged. And though nothing happened that night, everything had changed. Morning came slowly, the sun casting a soft light across the hardwood floor as Adrian stood in front of the mirror, towel over his shoulder, eyes heavy from a night without rest. The reflection that stared back at him didn't look drastically different, but something beneath the surface had changed. He could still feel it in the silence that lingered between walls. The kind of silence that no longer felt natural. It now carried weight, meaning, and the ghost of something that hadn't yet happened but threatened to. Downstairs, the familiar clinking of dishes echoed from the kitchen. Micah was awake. The sound should have brought comfort, should have grounded him in the routine of their shared space. Instead, it only sharpened his awareness. He delayed going down, taking longer than usual to get dressed. A pointless stalling tactic. Eventually, he stepped into the kitchen, where Micah stood at the counter, pouring coffee. The room smelled of toasted bread and dark roast. Simple things. Normal things. Micah didn't turn around right away, but Adrian knew he felt him there. The energy between them pulsed in the quiet. They exchanged greetings. Hollow, careful. Words chosen for safety, not meaning. Adrian sat down at the table, wrapping his fingers around the warm mug, letting the heat anchor him. He didn't look at Micah, not at first, but he felt every movement, every pause, every breath that came from across the room. Micah finally joined him, sliding into the chair opposite, eyes flickering toward Adrian before dropping again. There was a tension in his shoulders, subtle but present. They sat like that for a while, two people caught in a moment neither could name. Adrian broke the silence first, not with directness, but with a threadbare observation about the weather. It was safe, neutral. Micah nodded, responding in kind. But there was a pause after, one that stretched longer than it should have. A pause full of thought, hesitation, want. Adrian glanced up. Micah's eyes met his. Something cracked. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the slow unraveling of whatever wall they'd both been trying to maintain. And in that tiny moment of connection, all the tension, all the restraint of the past weeks condensed into a single point of gravity neither of them could escape. Micah looked away, exhaling, rubbing the back of his neck like he was holding something in. Adrian knew the feeling. It lived in his chest, too. The conversation that followed was quiet, uncertain. Not confessional, not dramatic. Just honest. Micah spoke of feeling displaced, untethered since moving in. About not knowing how to be around Adrian sometimes. About sensing something different, something he wasn't sure he was allowed to feel. Adrian didn't interrupt. He just listened. Every word stirred something in him, something that had been waiting for permission to surface. When he finally spoke, it wasn't with answers, only reflections, of things unspoken, of a pull he couldn't explain, of the difficulty in drawing a line when it kept moving with each passing day. The air between them thickened again, not with silence this time, but with clarity. And then, for the first time, Micah reached out, not boldly, not dramatically. Just enough. His fingers brushed the edge of Adrian's hand. A simple contact. 1 second long. But it felt like the world tilted. Adrian didn't pull away. He didn't speak either. It was enough to know that something had changed and neither of them had denied it. The rest of the day passed in slow motion. They gave each other space. Unspoken, but understood. Chores were done. Books were half-read. Music drifted softly from the other room. And through it all, Adrian's mind kept circling back to that single touch. That shared moment at the table. The feeling of truth between their hands, too delicate to fully hold, but too powerful to ignore. By evening, nothing was said, but the way they moved through the house, the way their eyes met across rooms, carried the quiet rhythm of something beginning. Something fragile, something real, something that neither of them could stop, even if they tried. The house felt different that night. Not louder, not busier, but undeniably altered. Adrian couldn't point to a specific change, but it lived in the air. A soft vibration beneath the quiet. A presence that seemed to wrap around him like humidity, impossible to escape. He stood by the living room window, watching the breeze move through the trees outside. His reflection in the glass looked calm, composed. But the truth, the real thing churning beneath the surface, was far more complicated. Upstairs, a door closed. Footsteps followed. Micah was moving through the house with a rhythm Adrian had learned to recognize, barefoot, unhurried, thoughtful. Each sound echoed louder than it should have. Not because of the volume, but because of what it meant. They hadn't spoken much since that moment at the table. Words felt too fragile now, too risky, but their silence no longer felt like avoidance. It was filled with recognition, as if both had agreed to sit quietly on the edge of something enormous. Adrian turned off the light and made his way upstairs. He paused in the hallway, listening. A faint click of a lamp. The sound of pages turning. Micah was in the guest room. Their guest room, really. His sketchbooks and clothes were scattered through the space like he'd always belonged there. Adrian passed the doorway, but didn't enter. Instead, he continued to his own room, closed the door behind him, and sat on the edge of the bed. The truth was no longer hiding. It had been growing slowly, but steadily, woven through shared dinners, glances that lingered too long, moments that hovered just short of touch. And now it pressed against Adrian's chest, urgent and impossible to ignore. He lay back and closed his eyes, but sleep stayed far away. Time passed slowly. Then came a knock. Soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. Adrian opened his eyes and sat up. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then he stood, walked to the door, and opened it. Micah stood there, backlit by the hallway light. His face was unreadable, his arms at his sides. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Adrian stepped aside. Micah entered quietly and stood in the center of the room, as if unsure where to place himself. The space between them was thin, paper thin. Adrian leaned against the dresser, waiting. The weight of the moment pressed down on both of them. Micah finally spoke, his voice soft and steady, though it trembled at the edges. He spoke about confusion, about the nights he'd stayed awake, questioning every glance, every heartbeat, about the way the house felt too quiet when Adrian wasn't around, about how everything that once felt simple had become something impossible to name. He didn't make declarations. He didn't beg for understanding. He simply told the truth. Adrian listened, his chest tightening with every word. There was no anger, no shame, only honesty. When Micah finished, silence returned. But it wasn't empty. Adrian crossed the room slowly. No words, just steps. He reached out, gently, and placed a hand on Micah's shoulder. The touch wasn't romantic. It wasn't even intimate. But it was real. Micah closed his eyes just for a moment, and when he opened them again, everything between them had changed. Adrian spoke then, not in poetry, not in absolutes, just a simple truth of his own, that he didn't know what they were, that he didn't know where this was going, that he was scared too, but that he couldn't keep pretending nothing was there. Micah didn't answer. He didn't need to. They stood there, quiet, eyes locked, and in that silence, they both understood that something had begun. Not rushed, not reckless, just real. Adrian stepped back. He gestured to the chair near the bed, an invitation, not into his arms, but into his space. Micah sat down. They didn't touch again that night. They didn't speak more than a few words. But they remained there, in the same room, both changed. Sleep eventually came for Adrian, slow and deep. And when he woke in the morning, the chair was empty, but the air still held Micah's presence, like the echo of something sacred. The morning was soft, wrapped in a mist that hadn't yet burned off under the sun. Adrian stood on the porch, a mug of coffee warming his hands. The yard before him was still, the kind of stillness that follows something irreversible. Inside the house, the echo of last night lingered. The room, the conversation, the closeness, it was all still with him. Not loud, not pressing, just present. Micah had left the chair quietly before sunrise. Adrian hadn't heard him go, but he knew. And yet, something in the room had stayed behind. A feeling, a shift. Adrian took a sip of coffee, his thoughts slow but focused. This wasn't a mistake. Not confusion. Not fantasy. It had taken him too long to admit, even to himself, that what was building between them wasn't temporary. He turned at the sound of the screen door creaking open. Micah stepped outside, hoodie thrown over one shoulder, his hair tousled from sleep. He looked like someone who hadn't planned what to say, but came anyway. Adrian nodded toward the empty chair beside him. Micah sat, silent, holding his own cup. The porch was filled with the smell of damp earth and fresh air, the kind of morning that always made Adrian feel both grounded and unsure. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. A few birds called out in the distance. The world slowly opened. Adrian finally broke the quiet with a low, steady voice. He didn't ask questions. He didn't make confessions. He simply said that what was happening between them deserved to be seen, not hidden, not suffocated. Micah nodded. His face was calm, but his eyes held something deeper, something honest. The air thickened, not with fear, but with vulnerability. Then, gently, Micah reached out and touched Adrian's hand. No pressure, no pull, just presence. And Adrian turned his hand over, threading his fingers through Micah's without thinking. It was the first time they had truly chosen to touch without doubt. Adrian looked over, meeting Micah's gaze fully. There was no fear there now, just understanding. The distance between them narrowed, not all at once, but slowly, with intention. A silent agreement, not out of impulse, but clarity. Their foreheads touched first. A brief moment of closeness, still and electric. Then, almost imperceptibly, their lips met. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't desperate. It was the kind of kiss born from tension, carefully held back until it could no longer be. It spoke of days spent wondering and nights spent not sleeping, of confusion and restraint and the comfort of quiet company, of two people who had carried something unnamed for too long and had finally given it permission to exist. When they parted, neither moved far. They stayed close, breath to breath, gaze to gaze. And for the first time, Adrian felt peace. Not the cold kind he had once mistaken for safety, but the warm kind that follows truth. Micah smiled, small and real. Adrian mirrored it. There were no promises spoken, no need for declarations. But something had begun. Not everything had to be defined that morning. There would still be questions, quiet moments of doubt, the weight of reality. But there would also be light, new light, a shared space where neither had to pretend. As the sun finally broke through the mist, casting golden rays across the yard, Adrian leaned back in his chair. Micah sat beside him, their fingers still lightly intertwined. The day ahead was unknown. But this moment, this quiet, steady connection, they knew exactly what it was. And that was enough.